Hello and welcome to This Is Not an Episode, a now weekly podcast where we talk about what's going on in the wide world of philosophy. Who are we? Well, I'm Jonathan Talent. I am a philosopher. Andy, who are you?
I'm Andy Fisher. I'm also a philosopher.
Excellent. We are superbly well qualified to talk about what's going on in the world of philosophy, Andy. What have you been doing this week?
So I've been thinking about some philosophy that I think about a lot, which is sometimes you read something and it just sticks with you. And this is some work by Laurie Paul on transformative experience. And it's one of those things that permeates just when I'm cycling and when I'm just living my life. And it's just a very fascinating bit of work. And it talks about how we trick ourselves into thinking that we can be rational in certain contexts. And we're in fact not, and we're actually irrational, and we are sort of being tricked by ourselves. So, for example, we might think, if we've been offered a particular job, or we're thinking of moving house, or you're thinking of having a child, or what I'm not, by the way, this week, then we think that we can get our bit of paper and we can do our pros and cons list, and we can work out what's going to be most valuable for us, and get your calculator out for your finances and talk to your friends and do a bit of research, and then we just calculate it. And what Laurie Paul's work is just that's just wrong. There's no, because of these types of experiences, they're sort of transformative. We just got no access to the right values to put into our calculations. So when I'm thinking, it's the rational thing to do to take this job or whatever, or move house, that's just a mistake. We can't know. So what we should do is to ask ourselves, look, what's the type of person I want to be? Do I want to be the type of person who takes risks and takes these sort of existential steps into the unknown? That's the only type of question you can ask, which is quite liberating in a way. So I mean, you've obviously come across this work before. Have you got any thoughts on transformative experience generally?
Yeah, so like you, I'm a big fan of Laurie Paul's work on this, and particularly I think the first paper of hers that I read on this was the one around parenthood. And good to hear that you're not planning on becoming a parent again this week. I'll come back to you next week for an update.
Yeah.
But one of the really elegant points that I think she makes in that paper is that when we're trying to evaluate some of these decisions, we often think about, well, what will it be like to do whatever it is, in this case, being a parent. And of course, the killer point that she makes is before you're a parent, you simply cannot know qualitatively what it's going to be like to be a parent. That whole becoming of being a parent is, and she chooses the word for a reason, transformative. And you think about the experience of sleepless nights, being covered in sick, being tired, being, whatever else it is that's associated with being a parent. But until you're in it, you actually do not have the ability to understand what it's like to be that thing. And of course, as you say, that completely then undermines the idea that when you're trying to decide, do I become a parent? Do I not? Well, pros in this column,
Yes.
cons in that. You can't access any of that kind of decision-making procedure if you actually don't know what it's going to be like. And so, yeah, I love that. I love that paper. The book that followed up, I think, is really cool. There's a nice discussion of vampires in the beginning there.
Yeah.
So yeah, a big fan. I guess I'm one of the things that always interests me about it is where that gap is between experiences that are transformative and those that aren't. But then, of course, when it comes to decision making, how do you know which ones will and won't be transformative, which is a whole nother kind of an issue. Yeah, I mean, you say it's sort of permeated everyday life for you, which I think is really cool.
Yeah. So actually, one thing that I'm thinking about, and I should ask you, but actually, if Laurie Paul's right, it won't help. But actually, how getting a dog, right? So, you think, very cute. You see all these videos, very cute puppies doing cute things, and you think, oh, I'm going to really love that. And then you think, well, what about the sick and the poo and all that other stuff? I'm not going to love that. So then I sort of weigh up, and then thinking about Laurie Paul's work, I just don't know until I've got this little bundle of fur running around. And actually, asking you is not going to be much help as a dog owner. You can tell me some practical things, and what's a good place to cheap pace to buy food or something, but none of that is going to help me or help us decide whether getting a dog is actually going to be something which is of value to me until I've actually got the thing. But so it's
I need to completely derail this discussion of transformative experience, Andy. Are you thinking about getting a dog?
Yeah, we're thinking about
it. Okay. So, I mean, maybe we should just can the discussion of transformative experience. Let me just tell you all about it. Look, you're absolutely right. And I think that, the things that I just didn't anticipate are all the sort of things that you're talking about. Walking around after an animal, picking up its poop off the street, is just not, that's not an experience that I think you're necessarily primed for without having had a dog. But equally, when he climbs up for a snuggle on the sofa, and maybe when I'm editing this, I'll just put a couple of cute dog pics over our faces at various points. But that feeling of what it's like is great. But again, as you say, unless you've actually done it, I can't reach into your mind and give you that experience.
Yeah, and I mean, just other examples. I was doing an open day talk when I was talking about transformative experience, and I was talking about having children as transformative. And I could see quite a lot of the parents sort of zoning out, like, well, we've done this. But then I mentioned, what about promotions and, whether you take a senior leadership role, and you could see a lot of them go, oh, this is actually really valuable, because we wrestle with, should I go with this promotion? Should I change my job? And we think it's, we'll watch lots of videos on the pros and cons and all that sort of stuff. But actually, if Laurie Paul's right, that's just not pointless, but it's just not doing what you think it's going to be doing. You've either got to make that decision that I want to be the person who tries this out, or you don't. And I think that's very liberating in a way, because you beat yourself up. You go, oh, I should have known these things. I should have known that. Well, no, you can't know it until you've actually done it.
Do you know what, Andy? That's a great point. I really like the leadership role example there. And people who are watching the podcast or listening to the podcast should know we don't rehearse or preempt any of these discussions. So I had no idea you were about to say that. If it hasn't already been written, we should totally write a paper on leadership as a transformative experience. So when we get to the end of this podcast, we really need to go and have a look at that space.
Yes.
But I think back to, you see all the reporting all the time about people who are not in leadership positions complaining about people who are in leadership positions, people who are in the leadership positions complaining about the people who aren't. Yeah. And as soon as you said that, I went, oh God, of course. Because when you're in those other situations, things just you are transformed. Your experience of the world is just fundamentally different. And so what you're anticipating is just completely different as well. Yeah, look, we should, I'll just put some dog pics up. We will go and write a paper about this, and we should just pause things there. I think we're done for today. Is that right?
Well, I need to finish the last paper we're writing on AI and epistemologic skepticism. So.
Oh, but that's with you. That's with you, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So look, I think there's loads in transformative experience, and we'll put a link in the notes for today's episode so people can go and read Laurie's work. Really recommend it. Brilliant stuff to read, and I think accessible to non-philosophers as well.
Absolutely. And she's got some good videos of talking about this, which is great. So just put it on YouTube and have a watch. It's great.
Cool. Great. Well, so apart from transformative experience, you've been wondering about whether or not trees think.
Yes, This is a write-up of a paper by John Branding in Philosophy and Biology journal. And what's neat is there's obviously a long-running question about what counts as having consciousness and what things are conscious, right? So in the olden days, people said animals aren't conscious. And then we go, oh, yeah, maybe chimps are. And then we go, maybe dolphins are. And then we start having these things about octopus. And, the question is, where do we stop? And people get into big fights, and you've got certain agendas, science and philosophy and stuff. And the good thing about this paper is it doesn't try to answer them. So you're not going to come away going, oh, trees are conscious or fish are. But it gives a roadmap to try and understand why the debates are thorny. And it talks about a way of conceptualizing the debate that helps us think through. So he's got these sort of three approaches, like the theory-based approach to understand whether things are conscious, which just basically says, we're conscious, we have brain states A, B, and C. Let's look if other things have brain states A, B, and C, and then we go, they're conscious. And obviously, there's some serious problems with that, right? We might think that that was a rather human-centric approach. It just rules out what we call, this multiple realizability stuff. Okay, so then he says, look, there's also what's called an analogy base, and that says, look, we work out where things conscious by, in some sense, seeing their soul on their faces, as Wittgenstein says, and how they sort of behave, what they do in some way, that sort of approach. And then that gives us some markers. And he says that's problematic also because how do you know what, I look like this when I'm surprised, etc., but other things might not look that, and therefore trying to track markers and identify those markers in relation to that is not going to help because, again, it's very human-centric. And then he said there's this very, very theory-light view, which is a sort of functional-based type approach, which is do things adapt, essentially, in the right sort of way. So hermit crabs go and they don't just pick any old shell, apparently. They go and work out which one looks the best, is going to be safest, and they do weighing up between stuff. I just have this great image of the sort of like right move for hermit crab.
I'm also wondering whether shell selection for a hermit crab is a transformative experience. But I mean, anyway, as you were.
To decide that, I guess we need to know if they're conscious. Yes. But of course, ringworms and I guess thermostats, right? They're not adaptable. They just do what's in there. They just respond in that way. Now, I mean, the point is, as a philosopher and philosophers listening will track in their heads, well, that's just a functionalist account, that's a behaviorist account. But what's good about this is it sort of gives it sets it out in a way that allows you to see whether enough markers are checked and a way of mapping that onto the debate. So what I think is really cool is it shows how philosophy can do some really good conceptual work and work about systematizing and structuring debates that are going to have real world importance. Because if it turns out that say octopus are conscious, then you're going to have to think about your fishing laws. So it was just a nice way of thinking about a debate. So if you're interested in thinking about where those markers are, where the cutoff points are, then this is a nice way of doing that.
No, that's a nice discussion. And what really resonates with me is your abstraction at the end there around this idea of philosophy being a really useful tool with which to approach lots of different debates. And that conceptual mapping piece of work where philosophers are often very good at seeing the structure of a debate, laying out what the options are, explaining what the move space looks like, choose A or B, C or D. Okay, now we move forward and then do a different set of options. And there's a really lovely paper by a sometimes collaborator of mine, Sam Barron, who looks at, in this particular paper, trust, explainability, and artificial intelligence. And again, we could pop a link down to that below. But what I really love about that paper is the way that what Sam is doing is he's talking about whether or not we can/should trust artificial intelligences, and whether or not in order to do so can be explained. Does it matter to us whether the explainability of the decision-making process bears on whether or not they can be trusted? And I love the way that Sam just frames it and says, okay, look, so here's what trust would look like. Here's what explainability would look like. Here's how that would play off into, and it's just so elegant. And
yeah,
I think that one of the things I really love about doing philosophy is that you get to know how different people think and see those conceptual spaces.
Yes.
And then there's almost that, okay, so how would, so I guess in the case that I'm thinking of, how would Sam think about this? But in the case that you're talking about, it's okay, how would so-and-so think about this?
Yes.
I think back to the philosophers who influenced me. It's okay, how do those different frameworks and approaches map? And that's just so helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And it'd be interesting just to throw around some ones that have had that influence. I'm thinking of the stuff on David's interpretive framework work. And thinking, well, actually, how would that interpretive framework work in this context? So there's lots of examples like that, and I think the philosophers are notoriously notorious probably, but are good at just looking at things that people talk about and just saying, well, what's actually going on? So I'm thinking of the late great Catherine Hawley's stuff on imposter syndrome and things like that, and trust, right? And how that really just shines a light of what's really going on when people are talking and operating.
I think you're right, and it's the positive flip side of the stereotype, right? So there
Yeah.
is the stereotype that, when you're talking to a philosopher and they sort of head tilt and go, but what do you mean by?
Yeah.
And all right, good for laughs and all that, but
Yeah.
the positive side of that slightly pejorative characterization is that, well, actually digging into what we really do mean by, and then exploring what those different options might be, helping us to understand those, has real world implications about
Absolutely.
how we behave, how
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
legislate, how we design artificial intelligence, how we think about laws around trees and
Yes.
octopi,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
octopuses, octa
Don't know. I think it's
fishing.
octopuses. Fish. Yeah. Fish. That would. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Um,
I think. I mean. Yeah. You're right. I mean. I think one of the problems is that this. One of the problems is that the sort of stereotypes of philosophy have arisen because of the sort of public philosophy that has happened in the past, where you get these people sitting in big chairs, smoking, and talking in a really sort of highbrow way. And you've been looking at sort of this idea of the old style philosophy, well, not looking at that, but thinking about the influence of old style philosophy in the public, with an article on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a nice piece that crossed my desk this week. Angie Hobbs, who I think has now left Sheffield, I think, but she was professor of public philosophy there for a while. She's done some great work in publicising philosophy, and has been revisiting the BBC the BBC Remember series, some of that televised philosophical debate and discussion that went on. And it might sound kind of weird for a podcast where two academic philosophers are talking about philosophy on a weekly basis, but just really interested in the question of, should we be doing this, right? Who is best placed to talk about philosophy in that kind of public sphere, to communicate the value and the import of it? And I'd be really interested in your view, but I didn't get to a position that I thought, aha, here is my well developed and well thought out position. But I think about the field of science communication, which is a whole massive field that exists. Academically, there are people who are science communicators. This is a profession. And this exists to make sure that what's going on in the scientific realm makes it out into the wider world, is communicated so that people can understand and appreciate the awesome power of science. But a lot of that science communication is not done by scientists. It is done by people who are highly skilled, trained to do the science communication. Some of it is done by the scientists. And I just thought, so should we be looking for a similar tranche of people, Andy? Should we be looking for the philosophical communicators?
Whoa. I guess I think so. So I'm just trying to think where I hear, where in the public we hear about philosophy. That was my first thought. And actually, I wonder if there's more going on than well, at least me, I realise, because I'm thinking of actually YouTube rather than BBC, but YouTube. So you've got very, very highly, watched channels like ContraPoints, and you've got Alan Barton's the School of Life, I think it's called, that get just hundreds of thousands of watches. So in some sense, that's going on, and they are philosophers, and they are good at doing it. So they're not. It's not. That's not just their job. So I think perhaps it does go on and go on well, but just not in the spaces that it used to. And I guess because there's not one unifying space where people talk about what's been going on in the world. There's lots and lots and lots of different spaces. Whereas you can imagine 80 years ago, or however many, Russell would say something on BBC, and then BBC Two would pick it up and talk about it. There's just loads of spaces where this stuff gets talked about. So I think it probably goes on a lot. I mean, an interesting little thing I read was the famous science communicator whose name I completely forgotten now, and it's gone out of my brain, about 60 years ago. And the view amongst his colleagues, because he was an academic scientist, was he's not a very good scientist because he does lots of telly. And actually, what these people did, I think it's Sagan. Anyway, we'll put it. Actually, what they found was he was better. He'd published more peer review, but this assumption that if you go into this side of things, the outreach communication, you are somehow undermining your genuineness as an academic. And what that research clearly shows is that's just not true. So yeah, that's just an aside, but I think the answer to the question is I think it probably goes on quite a lot.
I'm sure you're right, and I mean one of the classic examples, of course, is the work done by Nigel Warburton and stuff like Philosophy Bites, which is phenomenal and incredibly powerful. And I guess what I'm uncertain about, and I don't think we're gonna bottom it out today, but I would be really interested to hear from folks, anyone listening to this, what they think is. Are the people like you and me who do the academic philosophy, are we the right people to be sitting on a YouTube channel or on a podcast talking about things? So, should I stop running Trust Me, I'm a Philosopher, which is my other little venture where I talk about philosophy of trust and bits and pieces, and actually hand it off to people who are really geared up to doing this work, not because it undermines my academic credibility, which, let's face it, I have almost none of anyway, but because actually there are very specific skills that we should be looking for that maybe I just don't have. I don't have the training, I don't have those skills, and so actually I'd be best off handing it off to people who really do have that incredibly important and valuable skill set.
Yes, I mean, perhaps the final thing is, but one worry is if we do that, there might be a vacuum filled by people who aren't philosophers. So philosophers who say stuff you just think, oh gosh. So one example of that is, perhaps I won't name names, but in a very high profile, you can guess this, right? A very very high profile atheist person who's written lots of books and is always wheeled in to debate cardinals and stuff. Very expertise on one element of evolutionary biology, and then you just and that means you can talk about philosophy and theology in other areas, and that just seems, well, what, that doesn't follow. It wouldn't ask me to talk about heart surgery or evolutionary biology because I've done some philosophy. So a worry is if we don't fill those gaps, then other people might say things which are just very unhelpful and aren't thought out, and people go, oh, philosopher.
Absolutely, I think there is something to that, and I should say, if anyone wants to check out Trust Me, I'm a Philosopher on YouTube, Medium, or Substack, they are very welcome to do so. I am going to utterly ham-fistedly perform this link, so brace. I'm off on leave next week, so I'm going to go kiddos on half term, so we're taking a bit of time. Inevitably, this means that I am going to be ill because I'm going to stop. Okay. And you've been reading a little bit about the philosophy of illness, Andy.
I have, yeah. And so this was a summary of work on Philosophy Break, which is a really good site, which summarizes but not a very quick summary, quite a detailed summary of some key ideas. And this was summary of work by the famous philosopher Havi Carel. And she's very well known for her work on philosophy of illness. So here's another area where I should say off the bat, her work's been incredibly influential in medical education, how we think about illness. So direct impact into people's lives. And her work's incredibly nuanced and incredibly detailed on both metaphysics, epistemology, to others areas. And so I'm now going to completely run roughshod over all that, and I'm just going to give you some headlines. So she's written a number of books, and just trying to remind myself exactly the name of the Illness, the Cry of Flesh is a really key one. I think it's very powerful. And her idea is that the way we think about illness is wrong and incredibly unhelpful. And this comes from her personal experience. She had a very rare lung disease, which gave her 10 years to live. And in reflection, and here's someone who's doing philosophy that affects directly her life, and she was trying to think through what was going on, and she recognized that what happens in this situation is that you're either reduced down to biology and therefore a deficit, your body's not doing certain things, and then you're looked at in that way, and poor you can't do these sort of things. Or society looks at you as someone who should be pitied, and you can either be a hero or you're a tragic figure. And what she's trying to do is reposition the lived experience of being ill. So what the phenomenology of being ill as a lived experience, and from that standpoint, not being sucked into one of the other two sort of hurdles or problems, trying to find a fulfilling life. And she reports that, of course, it's not true for everyone, but she at least can find a fulfilling life even with this chronic illness. And I think that's a really powerful message, because often it's like, oh, poor person, whatever, but that's assuming one of these sort of either social or medical. And of course you can see how that taking lived experience of the phenomenology seriously would affect how you do medicine, medical education, nurse education, all these other sites of things. So incredibly powerful piece of work and very influential, and again made me think. I'd actually just read a book called Being Mortal, which is written by a doctor called Atul Gawande, and really, really powerful. It's a doctor's, just lots of stories of doctors talking to people and about that at the end of their lives, and him coming to realize actually how people experience their lives is really important. I was thinking, yeah, right, this is the work that Havi Carel's done. So yeah, again, very powerful.
Yeah, Harvey's work's brilliant. I think a really lovely example of not only someone who does great philosophy, but also whose work as a philosopher really reaches out and influences just so many other areas of academic discourse, but then also people's actual lives beyond academia, through her work, as you say, around education, and some of the other things that she's done. Just a real, genuinely brilliant philosopher, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that and again, she's not naive to think this will solve everything, but you can learn things that you wouldn't be able to learn if you hadn't gone through some of this or going through stuff like this. And I was a bit reminded, in a sort of, again, ham-fisted way, of the sort of soul-making stuff, John Hicks. So you in some sense become have different ways of being, but not a sort of bad ways of being, and that can help you see things maybe transformative, right?
Yeah, that's where I was coming back to. Yeah.
Yeah. And let me read you just a quote from her. So she says, I thought about it like this: I have no control over this illness, but I have full control over my emotions and inner state. I cannot choose to be healthy, but I can choose to enjoy the present, embrace the joyful aspects of my life, and train myself to observe neutrally my sadness, envy, grief, fear, and anger. The emotions washed over me. I observed them. By not fighting, by just letting them be, they became less mine and more tolerable. Yeah, powerful stuff.
It is, absolutely. And I think that would make a very nice note for us to be ending on today, with that little quote. So thank you very much for your time, Andy, and to everyone who's been listening. We'll be keeping an eye on what's going on in the world of philosophy, and we'll be back next time to talk to you about all of our incredibly insightful reflections. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.